Hi, Scott.
Hi, Katie. Are you still putting together episodes?
Yeah, we're putting together a bonus episode. We're calling it The Resignation. I'm Katie Hafner, and this is Lost Women of Science, a podcast in which we unearth stories of scientists who didn't receive the recognition they deserved in their lifetime. This is a bonus episode for our first season, The Pathologist in the Basement, which is all about Dorothy Andersen, the doctor who first identified cystic fibrosis in 1938. This time, we're going to look at a curious incident that happened at Baby's Hospital 11 years later in 1949.
Many on the Baby's Hospital faculty understood the situation to be a simple power struggle over Dorothy Andersen.
Did somebody want Dorothy out? But first, a quick refresher on who Dorothy Andersen was. Practicing at a time when many people refused to see female doctors, she pursued the less front-facing profession of pathology. Performing autopsies of young children in the basement of Baby's Hospital, Dr. Andersen began seeing a pattern of organs that had grown fibrous and tough. From there, she defined the workings of cystic fibrosis, a multi-system disease that attacks the pancreas, lungs, and a host of other organs. In the 1940s, cystic fibrosis was so new that Dr. Andersen became a rare expert on the disease and did what many pathologists and women did not do. She worked directly with patients, mostly young children. All their gratitude and affection for Dorothy Andersen was obvious to us as we put together our first season, but we found less evidence that Andersen was fully appreciated by the medical community at large. In particular, we wondered, what about her colleagues and supervisors at Baby's Hospital where she worked for practically her entire career? Did they value her? As I thought about this, I kept returning to a story that Scott Baird told me the first time we talked. You probably remember Scott from earlier episodes. He's the Columbia critical care doctor and Dorothy Andersen fanboy who just published a biography about her. We didn't have room to tell this story in the original episodes for the season, and that's left me feeling not quite finished. I wasn't ready to close the door on Dr. Andersen's life without getting into it. So here is that story, The Resignation, our final chapter of The Pathologist in the Basement.
It was 2 years ago in the winter that I became interested in the topic of trying to put together a life of Dorothy Andersen and started to put together some materials.
A lot of the research for Scott's book came from Columbia's archives.
When I first came here, they were only partially open. That is, there was some construction.
Which meant he couldn't get to Dorothy Andersen's folders right away.
And in the interim, I had decided to look at any other material that was available. One of the boxes that was available was Rustin McIntosh's box. And he was, of course, the chairman of the Department of Pediatrics and the chief physician at Baby's Hospital during the time when Dorothy was at Baby's Hospital.
Here's what you need to know about Rustin McIntosh, one of the main characters of this story. In the early 20th century, McIntosh was a rising star at Columbia, and in 1931 he became chair of pediatrics at Baby's Hospital. He was just 37 years old, which was very young to run a major department both then and now. According to some, he was warm and approachable. His staff called him Rusty. McIntosh defied statistics in an era when only 4 out of every 100 physicians were women. In his department at Baby's Hospital, he worked with several women. One of them was Dorothy Andersen. But Andersen and McIntosh could not have been more different. He was straight-laced and traditional, and she was neither of those things, to put it mildly. She had built her own cabin in the woods of New Jersey and constructed DIY lab equipment. She was crunchier than most of her academic cohort. Since McIntosh presided over Baby's Hospital for nearly all of Dorothy Andersen's time there, Scott went digging through the McIntosh files, hoping that in the details of his life, he would find traces of hers.
And I opened up this first box. It's this box here. I started looking through some of these files, thinking to myself, well, I'm going to have to just read through reams and reams of material to find anything interesting. And then I saw some material from 1919 when he was in the First World War, and I said, no, not there. And then I pulled out this one. It's the 8th file, and it says 1949 on it. So I opened it up. But I was unprepared for this. The first page on the first file that I opened up is a letter to President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it says, Dear Mr. President, I submit herewith my resignation as Carpentier Professor of Pediatrics and Executive Officer of the Department of Pediatrics to take effect at the close of the current academic year.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking because I was thinking the same thing. The White House is pretty far for a New York pediatrician to be going with a letter of resignation. But before Dwight D. Eisenhower became President of the United States, he spent 5 years as President of Columbia University. In his letter, McIntosh went on, This action implies, and as a matter of course includes, my resignation as Director of the Pediatric Services of Baby's Hospital.
No one I had known had ever mentioned anything like this, and I kind of went, What happened here? What happened was that the Board of Trustees decided that they were going to move the pediatric pathology offices and suite from Baby's Hospital to another location in the medical center several blocks away.
So here's what you have to know. The hospital wanted to add a new orthopedic unit to Baby's Hospital, and to make that possible, the Board of Trustees was playing Tetris with existing space. Moving the pediatric pathology labs, which at the time were housed on the 8th floor, seemed like an obvious solution. After all, in the medical hierarchy, orthopedic surgery is sexy and lucrative. Pathology is, well, not that.
We are working there in the background. Nobody talks much about us.
That's Dr. Ernest Coots. He's retired now, but he used to work as a pediatric pathologist at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. Remember, pathologists study the nature and cause of disease. They spend the bulk of their time performing autopsies and reviewing biopsy specimens.
The clinicians are recognized by patients, so that's a kind of a visible part of medicine. But there's also this invisible part, which are people working in labs, working in autopsy rooms, etc., who generate knowledge influencing the clinical care.
Pathologists don't work directly with patients, but they do work with doctors who work directly with patients.
Pediatricians and pediatric surgeons, before they go and talk to the parents of patients, they oftentimes want to come to the pathology laboratory and have the pathologist show them the microscopic slides related to the care of their patient.
And that's Dr. Jim Wright, a professor of pathology and laboratory medicine and a professor of pediatrics at the University of Calgary.
And so you can well imagine if pediatric pathologists were removed from the hospital and sent somewhere across town, those kinds of interactions can't happen.
One of the jobs of a department chair is to defend their people, and that often means defending the physical space those people need to do their work. Rustin McIntosh, who in 1949 had reached the pinnacle of his profession, was apparently so serious about that part of his job that he was willing to quit over it. Here's how he put it in an impassioned 5-page single-spaced document he wrote at the time.
The pathologist is forever puzzling over the nature of disease.
That's Scott reading from the McIntosh Manifesto.
So does the clinician, but his angle of approach is different. When the two get together, the chances of progress are enhanced. New ideas, fresh attacks are as apt to be generated in a casual chat as in a scheduled consultation. In fact, probably more so.
McIntosh continued that surgeons sometimes ask pathologists to accompany them in the OR, especially when removing a tumor, so the pathologist could weigh in on how radical the excision needed to be. For clinicians like McIntosh, the bottom line was this: In-person consultations with pathologists, even a quick conversation at the nurse's station, was as important as listening to a patient's heart and lungs. But practically speaking, how much of a disruption in the workflow would this move actually create? McIntosh was very specific on this point.
He noted that a round trip walking from Baby's Hospital to the proposed newer site of the pediatric pathology labs and offices would take at least 12 minutes. And it's very easy for me to envision him timing that several times to see he was an extraordinarily careful and meticulous man.
And for even more good measure, after submitting his letter of resignation,
Rusty called a meeting of his senior staff at which he outlined the facts. He concluded with something of a bombshell.
That moving the pathology labs
was tantamount to asking for his resignation. There was a quaver in his voice which defined the depth of his emotion. After a stunned silence, someone announced that he would follow Rusty with his own resignation, and he was followed by a virtually unanimous declaration of the same intent.
The board wasn't just dealing with the resignation of Rusty McIntosh. Now, the entire senior staff of the Department of Pediatrics at Baby's Hospital was threatening to quit in solidarity.
All of which sounds sort of like a movie. You can envision the scene with Jimmy Stewart and, I don't know, somebody else like that. And when I went further into this, it turned out this was basically about Dorothy Andersen.
Coming up, we'll look into the role Dorothy Andersen played in this fiasco. I'm Katie Hafner, and this is Lost Women of Science. So, according to Scott, Rusty's resignation really came down to Dorothy Andersen.
This seems paradoxical for a pediatric pathologist to be that important, but it clearly was.
Okay, that's confusing. Why wouldn't a pathologist be considered important? It turns out that there are hierarchies in departments, mostly related to money, power, and reputation. In a department like pediatrics 70 years ago, the superstars would likely be the cardiologists or the cancer specialists. So going to bat for a pathologist is a bit surprising. But it's also important to take a deeper look at the role pathologists play within a hospital's ecosystem, and with it, the role of space. There's a saying in academic medicine, space, the final frontier, since battles over space are so common and so often contentious. I happen to have a front row seat to these space wars. My husband chairs a large department at an academic medical center, and during COVID, while we've both been working about 20 feet from each other, I've heard a lot of debate over space. Somebody needed somebody else wasn't using theirs optimally, etc. I've never heard him raise his voice, much less threaten to resign, but it's clear that these fights are common and unpleasant. And victory often goes to whoever has the most clout. Pathologists wouldn't be high on that list. Again, Jim Wright, the professor of pathology.
Unfortunately, administrators often view labs as they would the hospital laundry service or any other hospital service. They don't see it as involved in medical care per se. They think it could be done anywhere by anybody.
But in many cases, it can't. And moving the pathologists out of the building risks those crucial informal collaborations with the frontline clinicians. But it's not just about patient care. It's also about power, adds Ernest Kutz, the retired pathologist.
We don't seem to have a voice, so we have to kind of fight to be heard.
Even now, pathologists spend a lot of time defending their space.
I've seen this happen again and again.
We had a similar episode 10, 15 years ago.
Where there are little battles related to space or cost.
There was an attempt to move the pathology department with the adult pathology, and we fought really hard.
In other words, dust-ups like this are common, but this was 1949. when pediatric pathology was still in its infancy.
Prior to the 1940s, 1950s, most children's hospitals did not have pediatric pathologists.
Baby's Hospital, where Dorothy Andersen worked, was well ahead of its time. In fact, as Dr. Wright, who's a historian of the field, pointed out, Baby's Hospital was ground zero for pediatric pathology in North America. Martha Wallstein, a doctor who worked at Baby's Hospital, was the first pediatric pathologist in the U.S. decades before all this happened. She started in the 1890s, but she was an outlier. So since pediatric pathology was such a new specialty, there wasn't much precedent for the particular fight in which Rusty McIntosh found himself embroiled. In his lengthy treatise, McIntosh made a case for this emerging field of medicine, asserting that clinical work benefits from having labs close at hand. But his argument gestured toward one pathologist in particular.
Many on the Baby's Hospital faculty understood the situation to be a simple power struggle over Dorothy Andersen.
Did somebody want Dorothy out?
Well, it sounds as if there was indeed a push to bring Dorothy and her resources to another site on campus. The other site was the rest of the Department of Pathology. Why? She was an enormously important asset, not just in research, but in education and in patient care.
Okay, we already know Dorothy Andersen had identified cystic fibrosis 11 years earlier, but she'd done so much more than that. She had developed the first CF diagnostic test and the first effective treatments. She helped run the CF clinic within the hospital, which, by the way, in 1949 had diagnosed and treated more than 100 patients. And she branched out, too. For instance, she became an early expert on congenital heart disorders, and she even described an extremely rare disease, type 4 glycogen storage disease, aka Andersen's disease. In his 5-page manifesto, McIntosh devoted the better part of a page to a discussion of Dorothy Andersen. He stressed that Andersen's research brought in tens of thousands of dollars in grant money, which is the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today, and her recent awards had brought a lot of prestige to the hospital. McIntosh even pointed out a time when Dr. Andersen treated a boy with cystic fibrosis who happened to be the grandson of a wealthy donor. The donor was so impressed with the quality of Dr. Andersen's care, he promised heaps of money for her next research project. And why was Dr. Andersen able to do all of this? It was at least in part because she was present, literally, at the intersection of research and clinical care. Later in her life, Dr. Andersen wrote, "Pathology enables the physician to keep one foot in the wards, where medical problems exist, and the other in the laboratory, where facilities for solving the problems are available." Here's Scott again.
Dorothy was essentially saying that pathology was a great profession because it allowed you both to locate problems and then to take them into your lab and solve them. When she first came to Baby's Hospital, she was a pathologist without significant pediatric experience, but within a very short period of time, she developed enough pediatric clinical expertise that she became essentially a pediatrician. Well, that's all well and good, and it worked out for Dorothy. It doesn't really work out that way for many people, I think, pursuing a career in pathology. And I think Dorothy was special in that regard. She was able to make it all work.
And with McIntosh having submitted his resignation and members of his staff threatening to do the same, with everything on the line,
apparently everyone backed down. So within a week and a half, the Board of Trustees was no longer going to pursue the removal of pediatric pathology from Baby's Hospital. McIntosh was no longer going to pursue his resignation, and everything sort of patched over.
We don't know if Eisenhower responded to McIntosh's resignation. It isn't clear that he paid much attention at all to this whole kerfuffle among a bunch of disgruntled doctors. And it's unclear what Dorothy Andersen thought about the McIntosh resignation threat, since so few of her letters and personal papers have been saved. What is clear is that a flurry of meetings and letters ensued, including a few barbs back and forth between McIntosh and his dean. Then, when the board abandoned its plans for the move, McIntosh withdrew his resignation. There was only one concession. The pathology offices and labs would move from the 8th floor to the hospital's basement. It was a compromise, but in the big battle, Rusty won. And so they carried on with their operations under the same roof as before, and so did Dorothy Andersen.
She had a half a dozen clinical research projects all going on at that time, and leaving Baby's Hospital would have made that much more difficult.
I called Scott one morning just as we were finishing up this episode to clear up a few things. I was especially curious and a little confused about McIntosh's relationship with Andersen.
Andersen and McIntosh were not any great friends, and in fact, it appears as if they didn't share much of a friendship at all, but they had respect for each other.
It appears that although McIntosh didn't much like Dorothy Andersen, he still fought like hell to keep her at Baby's Hospital.
There was no way he could let Dorothy go to another building. It would have been, in some ways, catastrophic.
Catastrophic, that might be a bit of a stretch. But who knows? Some of the work that Andersen would go on to do, including revelations about how CF affects the sweat glands, those things might never have happened if she'd left Baby's Hospital. In any case, this entire unfortunate incident says a lot about how much Dorothy Andersen meant to the hospital. And that takes us back to our original question. Is being an asset the same thing as being valued? Dr. Andersen continued to bring in donations and prestige, but her climb up the hospital hierarchy was painstakingly slow.
She didn't become an assistant professor until sometime in the mid-40s.
In the 1940s, Dorothy Andersen was already in her 40s.
And she didn't become an associate professor at Columbia University until the early 50s. And she didn't become a full professor until I think it was 56 or 57. It took her 25 years, I believe, to become a full professor at Columbia.
Okay, time out. This would not have happened to a man.
It's an interesting question. Hattie Alexander, who was a world-famous microbiologist, she didn't make it for 25 years, just like Dorothy. And I think that was relatively common for women back then.
Martha Wolstein is another example. She was the first doctor to specialize in pediatric pathology in North America, and she was hired by McIntosh's predecessor in the 1890s. Because she was a woman, they could pay her less. Wolstein's career at Baby's Hospital lasted more than 40 years, and yet...
She remained an associate professor.
I think that would be probably an unassailable fact that, there was discrimination and that being promoted would have been much slower and more difficult than, for a male counterpart who might even have been less talented.
Compare these stories to the meteoric rise of Rustin McIntosh. He was given a professorship at Columbia within a decade. 2 years later, he was appointed chair of pediatrics.
He was in his mid-30s, and he was designated a full professor. He certainly seemed to have great promise, but he had made none of the scientific contributions that Martha Wolstein had made for the previous 2 to 3 decades.
Being of value to an institution is one thing. Being valued as a professional is another. These women's contributions to Baby's Hospital were impossible to deny. McIntosh was willing to lose his job over Dorothy Andersen, but at the same time, he wasn't in a rush to promote her, and by Scott's account, he rarely praised her in public. The larger message of this incident is a sad one. Even if men in power make a cause célèbre out of the work a woman is doing, even if that entails a personal or professional sacrifice, material support like a raise or a promotion still might not reach her. Her accomplishments are not forgotten, but perhaps in the fullness of time, she is. This has been Lost Women of Science. Thanks to everyone who made this initiative happen, including my co-executive producer Amy Scharf, producer Sophie McNulty, senior editor Nora Matheson, composer Elizabeth Yunan, associate producer Ashreya Gupta, and the engineers at Studio D Podcast Production. We're grateful to Mike Fung, Scott Baird, Bob Wachter, Kathy Bennett-Warner, Maria Clave, Susan Kerr, Jeannie Stivers, Jane Grogan, and our interns Lisa Kopayeva, Juliana Russo, and Kylie Tanganan. Thanks also to Paula Goodwin, Nicole Schilling, and the rest of the legal team at Perkins Coie, and to Barnard College, a leader in empowering young women to pursue their passion in STEM, as well as the arts, for support during the Barnard Year of Science. Thanks also to Jack Kurtzman and Sam Fickinger at Hyde Street Studios in San Francisco, where this podcast was recorded. Lost Women of Science is funded in part by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Schmidt Futures, and the John Templeton Foundation, which catalyzes conversations about living purposeful and meaningful lives. Lost Women of Science is distributed by PRX and published in partnership with Scientific American. You can learn more about our initiative at lostwomenofscience.org or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We're at Lost Women of Sci. Keep an eye out for Season 2 coming in early 2022. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Katie Hafner.